Hello, everybody. I am Jim Collison. I'm Gallup's CliftonStrengths Community Manager. We want to welcome you to this Building Psychological Safety in Your Teams here on a LinkedIn Live. We'll give you a second to get connected. Apologize for being just a few minutes late if you're joining us. We'd love to have your top five there in chat if you want to get started. If you're joining us there and you want to throw that in chat, let us, and you know your top five, put those in chat. And we're asking this question before we get started here in one word. Just one. You can use two if you want. That'd be okay. Maybe even three is fine. But in one word, tell us how you're feeling today. You can throw those in chat. We'll be getting to those here in just a second. I want to introduce my guests here with me today. Allan Watkinson. I'll introduce him first. Allan, welcome. Tell us a little bit about what you do for Gallup and tell us your top five as well.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. Good to be here. I've been at Gallup just over 15 years, and my day job is a principal at Gallup here in Sydney, and I help leaders improve outcomes for businesses by creating better workplaces that they lead. So, in a nutshell, everything's about improving workplace performance through people. And my top five that I really like have served me well. Number one, harmony, connectedness, learner, relator, and significance.
That's great. Allan, thanks for coming in. You said your day job, it's day for you, night for me. So welcome to the world of doing these across time zones. Alicia Corsar is also my guest today. Alicia, same question to you. Tell us what you do for Gallup and in your top five as well.
Hi, everyone. So, yeah, Alicia Corsar here, and I lead with Achiever, Learner, Arranger, Focus, and Relator. And I'm a Gallup Workplace Advisor in Australia. So I get the pleasure of working with business leaders and clients across all different industries, supporting and really finding out and supporting them on all the different challenges that they're facing within their workforce. Years ago, I was actually a client of Gallup and I worked within a large hotel corporation. So worked with a variety of different teams and we partnered with Gallup in culture transformation engagement. And so I'm excited now to being on the other side in workplace advisory. And really this area of ensuring their psychological safety within teams, is critical, as we know. Also, one of the biggest areas that I get asked from business leaders that they reach out to us to support them on as well. So I
Oh,
think
oh,
maybe we should go ahead and kick off. Oh, sorry.
yeah, Alicia, before you do, let me just
Yes.
remind folks here that we're looking for them to in chat put in their top five, and I haven't seen many of these yet. But Mark threw that in. I asked in one word, and you can use a few if you want. Tell us how you're feeling, and we'd love to have you throw those in chat as well. Alicia, go ahead. Why don't you get us kicked off now?
Okay, a little excited here because we've got a great conversation that we're going to have today. So, Allan, let's kick off with you. You've been working with a lot of our clients in this area, so we'd love to hear. Let's break it down. Define psychological safety for us, please.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I was preparing for this conversation, I actually went back to look at the textbook definition of psychological safety to make sure I was aligned. And what I discovered is that this is a term that has been used by organizations for about 25 years. It was coined by a professor at Harvard University in about 1999. So it's still a relatively new term in business. But essentially, what a psychologically safe workplace gives employees permission to tell the truth, to speak up, particularly on things that are tricky topics, things that are around performance, things that aren't right, ethics and compliance and things like that. So it's really all about creating a workplace where people feel confident and safe to be able to tell the truth, whatever that looks like. I think that's kind of the original textbook definition. My definition is a bit broader than that. When I think about a psychologically safe workplace, it's really a workplace that doesn't do psychological harm or cause psychological injury to its employees. So a bit like physical safety in organizations, we would never want to physically harm our employees. A psychologically safe work environment would never do any psychological harm to employees.
And Allan, can you give us an example of psychological injury caused in the workplace?
Yeah, so my mind was cast back to about 12 or 13 years ago, and I was in a client meeting with a head of HR for a client that I've been working with over a number of years. And we were talking about some of his people and performance challenges. And he was talking about his high levels of attrition, absenteeism, the struggle for his organization to attract and retain good performers in their industry. And during that conversation, it was interrupted by a phone call on his mobile, and on his cell phone, and he took that call during the meeting. He said, "Excuse me," and it was one of his team members. And it turned out that call was one of his team members escalating an issue to him where an employee in the organization had raised a bullying and harassment claim against a manager. And so he said, "Look, I'm so sorry. We're going to have to sort of finish the meeting. I've got to deal with this bullying and harassment claim." And I said to him, "How many of these have you had?" And he said, "This is the third one I've had this week. A bullying and harassment claim made by an employee, a staff member, against a manager." And so when we think about psychological injury, then there's an example where an employee in a workplace has got to the point where it's got so bad that they've been brave enough to actually sort of take some action and call it out. So psychological safety in a psychologically safe work environment would rarely let an employee get to the point where they have to take that kind of sort of action against their manager or the organization. And so this organization was really struggling with, those sort of situations. People were going off sick, not turning up to work, leaving the organization suddenly. And that was also starting to get out into the media. So it was starting to damage the brand of that organization as disgruntled employees went out and spoke more externally. So this can be quite detrimental overall to an organization's performance.
Allan, what do you think the role of the pandemic was in this area of psychological safety? I know personally for me, it was not a topic I spent a lot of time thinking about or learning about pre-pandemic. It has certainly been a very big topic since. What was it about that maybe changed things, or what's your insight into that? And you can continue to throw your top 5 in chat if you like, and chat would also be a place for questions as well. But Allan, what was different about that, you think?
The pandemic generally was a bad thing for most people, but there were some things that it did highlight that actually have now raised and elevated the importance of things like burnout. So we've seen through our polling that levels of burnout, reported burnout, stress actually increased during the pandemic. So I think the pandemic has shone a light on things like burnout, stress that are actually to some degree caused by workplaces and workplaces that aren't psychologically safe. So yes, there was the external impact of COVID and all this external stress that was inflicted on all of us to some degree. But what the COVID situation highlighted was that organizations also need to play a more proactive role in looking after the psychological health of their employees, and failing to do that can be detrimental.
So you say failing to do that. I mean, what are some of the hazards associated with not addressing this? There, to your example of, maybe in the past, if somebody got a phone call and they were like, "There's some bullying going on," it could have been ignored. What's different today that when we think about managing it or prioritizing it? Why is that so much different today?
I think it's always been there,
Yeah.
but over time, we've realized the strong relationship between organizational performance and psychological safety. And through our research and others' research, and just focus more on it over time. So every organization that I've ever worked with cares about their performance levels to a huge degree. And so the impact that it can have on performance for an organization typically has a range. I think if you have an organization that is psychologically unsafe, that has a lot of the issues and challenges that we're talking about, the best case scenario for that organization is they may have a bit of disengagement. They may suffer from some ethics and compliance challenges. They may not have as many good ideas come to the table because people don't feel confident to be able to speak up and raise all the good ideas or raise the issues or problems. So there's not a good communication channel from employees. And so therefore, organizational performance starts to suffer. Maybe you lose some good people that you didn't see coming. A lot of absenteeism, struggle to attract good people, low productivity levels, disengagement. So I see that as the best case scenario. And then the worst case scenario is, where this persists, you get stress levels building. And we know that chronic stress then leads to burnout. And then burnout has its own challenges as well, as we've talked about. And ultimately, then you get into the realm of psychological injury, where employees are psychologically harmed by turning up to your workplace. And that impacts their own lives. That can be very detrimental to them individually, detrimental to the organization, very disruptive. And the human cost of that is significant.
Allan, I hear you saying we created kind of a stress debt during that time that now is causing a little bit of burnout, not a little bit, a lot of burnout from individuals. Alicia, I'm going to throw it to you here in just a second, but a question came in from chat that said, do you think there's a skills gap in the people managers that were highlighted during the pandemic? In other words, did we send, did that create or did that expose an area in people management skills that maybe or stress tested that hadn't been stress tested like that before? Allan, what are your thoughts?
Yes.
And then Alicia, you can weigh on that too.
Good question, and we definitely saw a skills gap that was highlighted through the pandemic. And that skills gap was the ability to have regular, ongoing, meaningful conversations. We used engagement as a measure of kind of, motivation, manager capability through the pandemic. What we saw was something very interesting, that managers who maintained those, what we call quick connect conversations, those organic, spontaneous, unscheduled conversations that you have more easily when you're in person with your team, the managers who were proactive on those virtually, who reached out to their teams, even if it was a message, not just a phone call, they did much better on engagement on average than managers who let those slip. So it really highlighted, which we always knew, but it highlighted even more, that the value of a weekly, ongoing, meaningful conversation with each team member. And that's something we can pick up a bit later in the session as well, because I think it's really critical that managers do that. They can go a long way to reducing the risk of psychosocial hazard if they do that.
So I know that we've got really an audience from all over the world, Allan. I'd be really interested to hear more on what some of Australia's new mandate is on what's classifying the psychosocial hazards as well, in line with what you've just been discussing with engagement.
Yeah, here in Australia is sort of interesting, and what has happened in the last couple of years is that the governments in Australia have elevated psychological safety to the same level as physical safety. So forever, organizations have had to demonstrate how they are reducing the risk of physical safety and harm through workplace health and safety policies. In recent years, they've then also had to demonstrate how they are managing psychosocial hazard risk. And when I talk about psychosocial hazards, it's really all about what are those things in the workplace, in the social environment, that positively or negatively impact psychological health in the workplace. And our main sort of government body has outlined, a code of practice that organizations need to adhere to, and they identify a series of psychosocial hazards that need to be managed. And they're interesting when you look at them. I'll give you just a flavor for what they are. A lack of role clarity is the first one. Job demands that are too much for individuals to endure. That's heavy workloads or kind of things that are beyond the capability of individuals to deliver on. Poor support from managers and the organization to deliver on work outcomes. Low job control, which is all about the ability of employees to be able to deliver what's expected, autonomously. Poor physical environment is also a hazard. Inadequate reward and recognition is one. Poor organizational change management, poor workplace relationships, unfair work practices. So the list goes on. What's interesting when I first saw those was I saw a commonality to that list of things I've just mentioned. And the commonality is the manager, that the manager influences all of those things significantly. And what was, really clear to us going back many years is that one of the root causes of psychosocial hazard and psychological injury is poor management. If there was one thing that organizations could do better is to improve the capability of their managers, that would start to address the issue that we've talked about.
When we think about our own Q12 assessment, our own employee engagement, whether you're using that or something else, those first 3 questions, I know it's expected of me. I have the materials and equipment to do the job that I need, and I get the opportunity to do what I do best every day. I heard you say all those things, and someone in chat had said, Deanna said the code of practice. How do you build accountability around that? How do you, I mean, to me as a manager, those seem like 3 pretty targetable questions to say, hey, in the folks that I've hired or that are currently there, do they know what they're supposed to be doing? Oops, sorry, I gave the thumbs up message there on screen. Do they have everything they need, and are they working in their strengths? Can you talk a little bit more about that, about how managers can, and you mentioned recognition, which is a question for me. You walked right down the Q12. So spend a little time talking about that, could you?
Yeah, it's the Q12 is a very good measure of engagement, as we all know, and it's a good diagnostic around manager capability to engage. What we discovered several years ago when we were working with organizations to help them address psychological injury cases and reduce the risk of psychosocial hazard was that as engagement improved, the number of these bullying, harassment claims and these other problems that I've described started to fall. And so we saw a very clear relationship between engagement levels and psychological injury. And so then we looked at the Q12 and we looked at the elements, and we realized that the drivers of engagement are also the things that actually reduce the risk of psychosocial hazard. And they go hand in hand. So start with, I know what's expected of me at work, as you pointed out. That's the foundational item for engagement. It's the foundational item for performance. So the other thing that I think is good news is that you can get high performance through engagement at the same time as addressing or reducing psychosocial hazard risk. It's one and the same thing. And so when we think about how managers manage effectively, those 12 conditions really describe nicely what good managers do. And they're basic things, good management 101, but management 101 drives high performance and it reduces psychosocial hazard.
There's a good question in chat that says, "Is there a need to redefine what a manager is?" And certainly in the roles that we're and Alicia, I'm going to bring you back in here in just a second. But do you think there's a fundamental need to redefine that?
I think it's more about defining the expectations of managers, because I do meet organizations that have not clearly defined the mandate role of their manager. Yet there's this unwritten kind of expectation that they're there to look after the engagement, well-being of their people. So there is an expansion of the remit of manager, and it's gone beyond just engagement. It's gone into the well-being space as well over time. But I'm not sure that every organization's redefined that role. So managers thinking, well, I'm just there to get the work done. And it's not my duty or realm to move into these other areas to look after the psychological wellness of people.
How vulnerable do you think our managers are in knowing what's expected of them? Like, we spend a lot of time at the front line talking about this, and yet oftentimes the management structure doesn't get that conversation. They don't know what's expected of them. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, we see that in the data very regularly. Is that we always look at manager engagement, and we look at that first item. And if managers aren't crystal clear on what's expected of them, we can't expect the rest of the teams to be crystal clear either. So absolutely, that's a good comment or question in the chat there, is that the first stage is to really clearly define the expectations of managers. And the expectation should be to create an environment that improves the psychological health of employees rather than damages it.
Yeah.
And the good news is they can do that. They don't have to be a psychologist to do that. They don't have to employ psychological practices or whatever, or go off and do a PhD in psychology. What they can do is the management basics well, starting with role clarity, starting with equipping people around materials and equipment, recognizing people a little bit more often, demonstrating care, listening to their people, ensuring opinions count. These are the management basics that the Q12 outlines.
Yeah, I think sometimes the executive staff forgets it is their responsibility to the managers to make sure there's role clarity and how that works going forward. Alicia, if we were to give you a materials and equipment question right now for the internet, you may give that a 0. Are you back with us? Can you hear us okay?
I'm sorry if I turned into a slow robot for a little while. I am back. Just a good old reboot does the job.
Hopefully you've been able to follow along a little bit. What would you interject at this point as we think about this conversation?
Yeah. Well, Allan was talking about the manager. I was thinking, an interesting area is that Gallup ran a comparison study recently with engaged employees and actively disengaged employees. And, it's really interesting that 65% of engaged employees have reported out to be less likely to say they've been treated with disrespect in the workplace, with their teams. And, another one was that the engaged employees, 37% likely to be less likely to be diagnosed with depression from a healthcare professional. And this is all does come down to how managers are working with their teams. And we think about these things that seem so simple, like being respectful to your employees and to your teams, and how that affects people's mental health. And some real interesting studies coming out with that as well too.
Alicia, I'm going to follow up though with you on that as we think about CliftonStrengths. We spent a lot of time talking about engagement. When we think about CliftonStrengths, and I'm going to toss it to you and then have you throw it over to Allan. What do you think? What do you think the role of CliftonStrengths is? Fits in this framework, fits into this to help with some of these problems, and then throw it over to Allan.
Sure. Well, one of the things with CliftonStrengths is that for example, bringing in a new employee or an employee into a team, it's that feeling of being included, that a manager can understand what that employee's strengths are, and likewise for that employee with that manager, and having that kind of environment where something a little bit more about that person's behavior, and where in the areas that they may feel more stressed out, or other areas, understanding their strengths and being able to embed that into the culture definitely fosters for more of a psychologically safe environment, especially with teams.
Allan, you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, CliftonStrengths is a terrific tool to build psychological safety. People feel respected for who they are. They can be themselves. It builds tolerance within teams as well, and understanding of the value of each individual as well. So more inclusive culture as well. But in the absence of a good level of engagement, then the impact of a tool like CliftonStrengths is limited. So if I'm not clear on what's expected, I'm not equipped to do my work, I'm not having enough conversations with my own line manager, then we can do a CliftonStrengths session over here, and that's going to have much more limited impact. So we need to look at both.
Allan, you keep going back to this idea of a quick connect and everything we talk about. How important is it as we think about those tools of preventing this? Let's transition a little bit into this idea of prevention. We've talked a little bit about why and how, but as we think about prevention, how important is how important is that conversation between the manager and those that they're managing?
That is the key to success here. You do not want to get to the point where someone has raised a complaint against a manager. That doesn't happen overnight. That kind of builds up over time through a lack of conversation, lack of support. So those quick connects, I'm always telling busy managers that rely heavily on those quick connects and see them as an important engagement conversation, important performance conversation, important psychological safety conversation as well. There are 3 questions that I recommend every manager ask on a weekly basis. And those 3 questions are, how are you going? How's your work going? And what support do you need? So how are you going? How's your work going? What support do you need? And in that order, we start with you as a person. Then we talk about your work, and then make sure you have the support you need. If more managers could ask those 3 questions on a weekly basis to each person, and that can just take a few minutes, that's your quick connect, we would see better engagement, better performance, more psychologically safe work environments.
That is one of those areas, I think, when going back to a conversation we had early here, were the managers prepared for in the pandemic to have these conversations? We changed in some cases. Not everybody got to go home, right? There were, millions of people still going into the workplace, right? But completely disrupted from that standpoint. Alicia, as we think about, and as you're thinking about some questions for Allan as well, kind of in that area, that this idea, and let me bring up Deanna's question. I want to throw it to both of you actually. What by which criteria can we measure the effectiveness of providing psychological safety via performance management? I mean, Allan, maybe when, or Alicia, when does this become a goal that we set that then we can measure throughout are we talking that kind of practicality in this?
My response to that would be we may not ever assess a manager on the psychological safety of their team directly, but we should always make sure that they're accountable for performance. That's what they're paid to deliver on. And then we look at how they achieve that performance. Do they deliver in a way which is positive, looking after the psychological safety of their teams? And we can look at that in a couple of different ways. We can look at it through engagement, through that lens, but we can also look at it more broadly through culture. So we do a lot of culture diagnostics for organizations as part of their broader survey. And we look at other aspects of culture that, again, the leaders and managers of the organizations have an influence over. So, how is bullying and harassment tolerated? How are unethical situations dealt with? So you can get a sense, of the broader culture, through our culture asset index as well. So we're very often looking at other aspects beyond engagement, but those are some things we can get a read on the effectiveness of those managers. But ultimately, they need to be assessed on performance. That's why we're in business. But how they get there is also important.
Alicia, your thoughts on this? Jump back in, maybe
Yeah.
thoughts and questions.
I think that one of the main things that come back in my mind was even just being if with a tool like engagement, if you are able to somewhat measure, understand the state of the workforce, you're then able to obviously see where the gaps are. But more than that is you know how often are we having meaningful conversations with our staff, and how supported are the managers to be enabling a kind of a framework and a setting for that. And then even like another layer is there a safe place for an employee where if they feel like they aren't being treated with respect, or they feel like there is some form of bullying or harassment, do they have a safe place to be able to to speak with somebody about that as well too. And those are some of the areas where if you are able to get a bit deeper understanding in that, then you are definitely fostering more of a psychologically safe environment.
During my annual performance review that I had this year, my manager asked me this very important question, which is, how often do you want to meet with me? And I thought that was so nice to give me the opportunity to set the agenda level, to say, what's important to you? You pick the frequency at which you want to do that. And I thought, man, what a great question, Allan. You had some questions as well, but what a great question to ask. What do you need from me and the frequency that we need to be together? I think I could have said daily and it would have been okay. It would have been a struggle to get that done every day. Although I manage, I have someone that I manage that I do meet with every single day. And that's just part of what we do. It keeps the ball rolling. We're just a few minutes out from wrapping this up. I'm going to throw it back to you guys, Allan, Alicia. Kind of final thoughts as we wrap this up. Allan, let me start with you, and Alicia will give you the final word. How's that sound?
Just a few things for different groups in organizations to think about, how to manage the risk of this at a leadership level, at a CEO executive level level. Then I think it's all about the culture. They are the owners of the culture. So what are they doing to role model, psychological safety? How are they dealing with poor management practices? One of the key questions that leaders can ask and should ask is, are employees better psychologically as a result of working for us? And it's really a sort of an overarching question that then raises questions about the culture. And I think also then ensuring that manager capability is a key priority for organizations if they want to address psychological safety. But the great thing about that is they also get a performance boost through all that good work.
Yeah. Alicia, you want to have the final word? I'll ultimately have the final word, but do you want to have the final thought on this?
Well, what comes to mind as well as if you're thinking about with leadership, and if they ask themselves with independent contributors in a team, and let's say they've been excelling and they're performing really well in their role, and then they move them up to be a people manager, have you enabled them to be successful with managing their team? Have you provided, training to become good people managers? A lot of times we've been talking about this for ages about putting an individual into a people manager role. Like they need that development and nurturing as well too, so that they can create a really,
For those of you who are listening live for us today, thanks for coming out. Loved your questions. Listen, this is just the start of this conversation, and we'd love to continue that with you. If you are in an organization, you've got some questions about this, you want to talk to us about it, you can send us an email, coaching@gallup.com. It doesn't mean it's about coaching. That's just an easy email address for you to remember. Allan, are there other ways for them to get a hold of us as far as if they wanted to continue this conversation?
We're on LinkedIn, as we all are. So please reach out on LinkedIn if you like.
Yeah, we'd love to continue the conversation with you, and there's lots of great ways to get that done. If you're listening live, thanks for coming out. If you're listening to this as the podcast, thanks for making it all the way to the end, and we appreciate you as well. Thanks for everybody for coming out. Hannah, always, she's our ringer in the chat room, and Hannah, thanks for being on the other end of this as well. We'll see you back for another LinkedIn Live. Stay close to us on LinkedIn because we post these here every time we do it. If you're in Australia, thanks for taking your lunchtime to be a part of this today as well. And with that, we'll say goodbye, everybody.